"50 years ago today, January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed between Dr. Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor for the United States, and Mr. LBII, the Senior Politburo member for the North Vietnamese. This ended the U.S. participation in the Vietnam War and allowed the return of 591 American POWs from the prisoner of war camps in and around Hanoi. That meant they were able to come to freedom and home. But how did this occur? It didn't just happen overnight. We were in that war for some 8+ years. A number of the POWs have been up there over 8 years. But President Nixon had the courage enough to order the Linebacker II operation after the Paris peace talks had broken down in mid-December 1972. The results of that operation were the signing of the peace accords and extracting the U.S. participation from Vietnam. So we're going to take you from the C-141 and show you the weapon system that allowed us to get a peace agreement between the U.S. and Vietnam, North Vietnam, the only airframe that could do the mission that President Nixon wanted. This B-52D took part in over 170 missions in the Vietnam War, including the Linebacker II missions. Let's do a little bit of a walk around and discuss the airplane. So the B-52 has 6 crew members. It's got 2 pilots, a co-pilot upstairs that eject up going out of the airplane if they have to. Downstairs you have the radar navigator, which is basically the bombardier from World War II terminology. He sits right here, and here's his ejection hatch. You can see on the other side is the navigator, which I was in B-52s, and he also has a downward ejection seat. Upstairs in a back compartment here is the electronic warfare officer, and he has what's called jammers that detected threat radars, and he was able to put pulse jamming against those radars to block their detection of the B-52. It's 150+ feet long, 158 feet, 185-foot wingspan. Fully loaded, it weighs 450,000 pounds. It has 8 jet engines. They're all water injected if you need it for the max gross weight takeoffs, which we did in Linebacker II. So now let's walk around the airplane. The wing actually starts to fly before the airplane does, and it has 15 feet of motion that wing can bend at the very end. You notice up here behind me is the ailerons that control the airplane. It's very different than the G model, which doesn't have ailerons. That made a big difference in Linebacker because the D model was able to sustain damage and still fly using partial ailerons and keeping the plane level to exit the target area. The G model was fully integrated, and if it lost one system, you invariably could not fly it. Back here in the tail was the gunner's position. You can see the canopy of his little area that he had. He was over 140 feet from the crew compartment up front. His only way to get up there was crawling through the bomb bay if he ever had to get back up front. The gunner also does not have an ejection seat in the D model. The G model, he had one, but he wasn't back here in the tail of the airplane. It was actually a plus to have another set of eyes in the very rear of the D model, and they were able to call missile shots coming up at the aircraft over Hanoi. That was a big advantage. The gunner had to jettison the 450 caliber machine guns you can see on the rear of the airplane. He would pull a handle and that would fall away, and then he'd have to disconnect, had his parachute on, and roll out the back of the airplane to bail out. And that happened on a number of occasions. As mentioned, the B52D wing is dry. It doesn't carry any fuel. But out here on the end of the wing on each side, you see an external fuel tank, which carried a number of gallons, obviously, that fueled the engines on each side. You'll also notice the little outrigger gear I mentioned previously, and that oleos up and down to keep the ends of the wings, when they're fully loaded with external fuel, to keep them off the runway. The wings, as I mentioned, actually fly before the airplane does, and the water injection directly into the engines itself produces a considerable amount of black smoke. The newer engines on newer jets don't have that issue. Okay, so let's walk over to the bomb bay and I'll show you the mass size of, it's over 1,000 cubic feet of space in the B52D bomb bay. Well, we're now inside the B52D bomb bay. It's a double bomb bay, the forward section and the aft section. It can hold 66 750-pound bombs or 84 500-pound bombs. The gunner in the rear of the airplane, if he has to come up to the front, he has to crawl on this catwalk up here, which is very, very narrow. And if he's on oxygen, it's a pretty tough crawl of about 140 feet. The bombs were mounted on steel racks, which are mounted vertically in the bomb bay here and all wired through to where the radar navigator sits. And there are lights in that navigator compartment that show you the bomb is on the rack. It's not armed, but it's on the rack. And when they do release the bombs, they turn the light out and you know that bomb has fallen out from the bomb bay.